Good evening, I'm Amna Nawaz.
And I'm Jeff Bennett. On the NewsHour tonight, the CIA director visits the acting president of Venezuela, while the nation's opposition leader visits the U.S. and pushes for a transition to a democratic government.
There are things that Delcy Rodriguez or any of the members of the criminal structure will never be able to provide. Trust, rule of law, reconciliation, citizen participation and support. Never.
New restrictions are placed on Elon Musk's artificial intelligence program that was able to generate explicit images, but serious concerns remain.
And how Iran's uprising met a brutal crackdown, and how a pledge of U.S. help seems to have gone unfulfilled.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
On an American Cruise Line's journey along the legendary Mississippi River, travelers can explore Civil War battlefields and historic riverside towns. Aboard our modern fleet of American riverboats, travelers can experience local culture and cuisine while discovering the music and history that define the mighty Mississippi. American Cruise Lines, proud sponsor of PBS NewsHour.
Friends of the NewsHour, including Jim and Nancy Bildner, and the Robert and Virginia Schiller Foundation. The Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation, upholding freedom by strengthening democracies at home and abroad. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado told an audience in Washington, D.C. today that she's confident democracy will return to her nation.
Almost 2 weeks after the U.S. arrest of now former President Nicolas Maduro, Machado revealed little of her own plans. As Nick Schifrin reports, that hasn't stopped the Trump White House from engaging with the rest of the Maduro regime it left in place.
Today, the first image of what U.S. officials billed as a historic meeting. CIA Director John Ratcliffe greeting interim Venezuelan President Delcy Rodriguez. That handshake and Ratcliffe's trip to Caracas would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. Especially to visit U.S.-sanctioned nationalist politician Rodriguez, handpicked successor to captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. But a U.S. official says the meeting was a sign of an improved U.S.-Venezuela relationship.
Nosotros destruimos la droga.
And that Venezuela must block drug trafficking and provide the U.S. economic opportunities.
This has nothing to do with a tension or decision between Delcy Rodriguez and myself.
But in Washington today, opposition leader Maria Corina Machado urged the U.S. to proceed with caution.
Delcy Rodriguez, yes, she's a communist. She's the main ally and representation of the Russian regime, the Chinese and the Iranians. But that's not the Venezuelan people, and that's not the armed forces.
Last night, Machado gifted President her Nobel Peace Prize. Only 150 have ever been awarded, and one will now hang in the White House, dedicated to President Trump's, quote, principled and decisive action to secure a free Venezuela.
And she gave me her Nobel Prize, but I'll tell you what, I got to know her. I never met her before, and I was very, very impressed. She's this is a fine woman.
Machado praised the president, but did not pull her punches, especially in Spanish, in her criticism of a politician whom she believes cannot deliver long-term stability.
There are some things that Delcy Rodriguez may be able to deliver, forced by power because she is terrified of President Trump. But there are things that Delcy Rodriguez or any of the members of the criminal structure will never be able to provide. Trust, rule of law, reconciliation, citizen participation and support. Never, never, Therefore, it is not sustainable, and she knows it.
But if that's what she argued to the president, he was not persuaded.
Why align with Delcy Rodriguez and the representative of Maduro and not with Massado, who have the support?
Well, if you ever remember a place called Iraq where everybody was fired, every single person, the police, the generals, everybody was fired, and they ended up being ISIS. Instead of just getting down to business, they ended up being ISIS.
Last month, I spoke to Graybull Rescue's Brian Stern, who organized Machado's daring escape from Venezuela.
She has rock star level status in the country. She got on a boat, and that boat was not what most people think. It was a very small boat. The seas were between 5 and 10 feet.
And now, for the first time, Machado admitted she thought she would not survive the journey.
So it was a very risky, dangerous, and scary moment, I have to say. And it lasted several hours. But at the end, as I say, we have moved ahead de la mano de Dios.
Thanks to the hand of God.
It is a miracle, and I'm here.
And so Machado continues her campaign to deliver democracy back to Venezuela and convince President Trump of its potential. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
In the day's other headlines, President Trump stepped up his threats about taking over Greenland today, suggesting that he may place tariffs on countries that don't support U.S. control of the territory. Mr. Trump made the comments during an event at the White House today, where he repeated his claim that the U.S. needs Greenland for national security reasons. It comes as a bipartisan delegation of U.S. lawmakers were in Copenhagen today. They met with the leaders of Denmark and Greenland in an effort to, as they put it, lower the temperature. Alaska Republican Lisa Murkowski told reporters the majority of Americans disagree with President Trump.
Greenland needs to be viewed as our ally, not as an asset. When you ask the American people whether or not they think it is a good idea for the United States to acquire Greenland, the vast majority, some 75%, will say, we do not think that that is a good idea.
Murkowski also told reporters there are, quote, tools at our disposal for Congress to rein in President Trump's ambitions towards Greenland, though he himself has said that anything less than U.S. control is unacceptable. The U.S. Supreme Court says it will hear an appeal from Bayer to block thousands of state lawsuits claiming its Roundup weed killer causes cancer that could potentially save the company billions of dollars in damages. Bayer contends that the EPA's approval of the weed killer without a cancer warning should rule out further lawsuits. Some studies have linked Roundup's key ingredient to cancer, though the EPA says it's unlikely to be carcinogenic when used as directed. The court has not yet said when it will hear the case. Virginia lawmakers passed a constitutional amendment today that would allow the legislature to redraw voting maps ahead of this year's midterm elections. The vote landed along party lines in the Democratic-led state Senate. If Virginians approve the measure, it could help Democrats gain as many as 4 seats in Congress. Before the vote, lawmakers from both sides laid out their cases.
This isn't about payback. It's about restoring and preserving balance to our system.
And I will grant that we started it, but a number of states have stood up to bad ideas.
Earlier this week, Virginia's Democratic leaders said that a new map would be made public by the end of the month, with a referendum to follow in April. Democrats currently hold 6 out of Virginia's 11 seats in Congress. The Trump administration says it will delay involuntary student loan collections, meaning it won't be garnishing people's wages to claw back federal debts. In a statement, the Education Department says the delay allows them to implement major student loan repayment reforms to give borrowers more options to repay their loans. The department had said it would notify borrowers this month that their wages would be garnished. According to the Congressional Research Service, more than 42 million Americans have student loans totaling more than $1.6 trillion in debt. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney announced today that his country is cutting its 100% tariffs on electric vehicles from China.
We've started a new era, a new chapter of our partnership.
Carney made the announcement during a visit to China, the first by a Canadian leader in 8 years. In exchange, Canada will get lower tariffs on some farm products. Carney and Chinese President Xi Jinping also pledged to work on building stronger ties between their two nations after years of tensions. Canada has largely followed the U.S. in imposing tariffs on Chinese products, but Carney said today that they are building a new partnership for what he called current realities. In South Korea, a court has sentenced the country's former president Yoon Suk-yeol to 5 years in prison. In Seoul, Yoon's supporters held banners that read, "Make Korea Great Again," as he pulled up to the courthouse in a bus. It's the first verdict out of 8 criminal trials stemming from Yoon's failed declaration of martial law in late 2024. That triggered nationwide protests and led to his ouster. Yoon has argued it was within his powers to declare martial law. He still faces other charges, including that his actions amounted to rebellion, for which he could face the death penalty. And on Wall Street today, stocks ended a bit lower to round out the week. The Dow Jones Industrial Average slipped about 80 points on the day. The Nasdaq fell around 14 points, so a small loss there. The S&P 500 also ended just barely in negative territory. Still to come on the NewsHour, David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart weigh in on the week's political headlines. What to watch for as Miami prepares to take on undefeated Indiana for the college football championship. And the latest episode of the PBS News podcast, Settle In, explores changing old habits.
This is the PBS NewsHour from the David M. Rubenstein studio at WETA in Washington, headquarters of PBS News.
Elon Musk was forced to put more restrictions on his social media platform X and its AI chatbot Grok this week after its image generator sparked outrage around the world. As Liz Landers explains, Grok was and still is creating non-consensual sexualized images, prompting some countries to ban the bot.
Musk finally began bowing to pressure this week and announced that X will use geo-blocking to prevent Grok from creating deepfake images of people in revealing swimsuits, underwear, and other clothing in places where the law prohibits it. But the move has not stopped the standalone app known as Grok Imagine from generating explicit images. The late changes have not appeased regulators, and now the governments of Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines have banned the chatbot altogether. Britain and Canada have launched probes into Grok, and the possibility of tougher penalties for Musk are on the table. To help us understand more about Grok's troubles and why they persist, I'm joined by Rihanna Pfefferkorn, a policy fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Rihanna, thank you for joining us this Friday.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with, what does this latest series of problems with Grok, these sexually explicit, non-consensual images, what does this tell us of the safety of women and minors on the internet?
Well, it illustrates that having your image online or taken a view while you're just out in public living your life is no longer safe from being manipulated in order to depict you in a humiliating and harassing context in which you never appeared in real life. That's irrespective of whether you yourself personally may have an account online, since other people could post pictures of you or of your child, even if you don't have an account on X or on Grok.
Just yesterday, Ashley St. Clair, who is the mother of one of Elon Musk's children, she sued Grok, alleging that it was negligent and allowed users to post deepfakes of her in explicit poses, even after she complained to the company. Here's what she told CBS.
Grok said, "I confirm that you don't consent. I will no longer produce these images." And then it continued to produce more and more images and more explicit images.
How are these images bypassing Grok's safety systems? How is this legal?
So it's a great question. I don't have visibility into what Grok's internal safety systems are. It sounds like gradually, in response to regulatory and public pressure, they've been trying to institute more safeguards. But it's really difficult to implement effective safeguards against various kinds of unwanted content. As we can see playing out from Grok's own users are very creative in how they try to get around any guardrails that may have been built in order to continue to generate the kind of content that, even in good faith, a platform may be trying to inhibit its model from producing.
Grok has had other problems in the past year or so. There was anti-Semitic tropes that it was posting. It even praised Hitler. What is the sense in Silicon Valley and in the tech community about why Grok is acting this way and cannot get a hold of itself?
You know, that's a complicated question. I would suspect that some part of it may have to do with what training data has gone into the model. It may be that there isn't child abuse imagery directly underlying the model here for Grok, but it might be that it was trained on extremist or Nazi and white supremacist material. So that might go to account for it. And I'll note that XAI filed a lawsuit shortly before New Year's, trying to enjoin a California law that has just gone into effect that would require AI companies to transparently release a summary of their data training sources.
You wrote a New York Times op-ed a few days ago. It said, quote, "There's one easy solution to the AI porn problem." In a nutshell, what would that be? What is the solution here?
Well, I'm not sure that it's as easy as the headline suggests. Nevertheless, what I argue in the op-ed for the Times is that AI researchers and AI model developers need what we would call a safe harbor in the law to enable them to better test image generation models for their capacity to produce potentially illegal content without themselves fearing prosecution for trying in good faith to better safeguard those models.
Yeah, I thought that was particularly interesting. Can you talk a little bit about what that means, those red teams, and how AI researchers basically work on this right now?
So red teaming is the practice of basically trying to act like a malicious user would and try and attack your model every which way to see if you can figure out what exploits may be latent, what loopholes are there, and then you can try and close those holes in order to make the product safer and keep actual bad actors from misusing those potential loopholes. The problem with illegal imagery in particular is that there's no exception or defense in the law for research or testing activities. And so we face a situation where the people who are developing and testing these models know that the malicious actors are going to try every which way to exploit those loopholes and aren't constraining themselves, but they themselves have to operate effectively with one hand tied behind their backs.
The Department of Defense announced that it's going to start using Grok after Secretary Hegseth announced this partnership earlier this week. Does this raise concerns with you, either from a national security perspective or from a personnel perspective?
I think from both. For one thing, I do think that the Department of Defense should answer for why taxpayer dollars are going towards what has become a notorious non-consensual deepfake pornography generation machine. In addition, it seems like there might be ways that either these sorts of misbehaviors that are showing up within Grok or other potential unknown exploitable problems with Grok might be leveraged against American national security once this product is fully integrated into even classified Pentagon servers.
Rihanna Pfefferkorn, thank you so much for joining the NewsHour this evening.
Thank you.
It has been over a week since Iran imposed a complete internet blackout, keeping most of its 90 million people cut off from the outside world. Human rights activists say the death toll from the government crackdown has risen to more than 3,000, and a leading Iranian cleric called today for the execution of prisoners. But today, President Trump thanked the Iranian regime for not executing what he said were hundreds of political prisoners who were facing the death penalty.
Iran canceled the hanging of over 800 people. They were going to hang over 800 people yesterday, and I greatly respect the fact that they canceled them.
And the Crown Prince in exile, Reza Pahlavi, held a press briefing in Washington today and urged U.S. military intervention.
What will hurt the regime most? By dismantling its apparatus of state terror and repression. A lot of it are the regime's military, paramilitary assets, mostly IRGC targets. So I'm calling for a surgical strike on those means.
To help us understand the events in Iran, we turn now to Abbas Milani, Director of Iranian Studies at Stanford University, and Ray Takei, Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in Iran and U.S. foreign policy. Thank you both for being here. Ray, we'll start with you. Was the regime in Iran ever truly on the brink of collapse? And if not, what conditions need to exist for that to happen?
When it comes to the Iranian regime collapsing, we seem to oscillate between inevitable and unthinkable. The regime certainly experienced significant stress in terms of popular uprisings that it experienced throughout the country. That comes at a time of foreign intervention that it was fearful of, and of course, depletion of its economic resources. However, I do believe that the regime has sufficient resources to get through this particular phase of protests and gain control of the streets. Now, if these demonstrations persist, then that is likely to tax its resources in a more significant way.
Abbas, a question about these protests and demonstrations. I know you've been able to reach a few people there despite the blackout. In simple terms, have the protests been extinguished or have they just been pushed underground?
I think they have been pushed into temporary silence. I don't think they have been extinguished. If you look at the 45-year history of this regime, you see these cycles of resistance, repression, and then the reemergence of the resistance, because these problems are structural. The regime is incapable of solving them. People become increasingly frustrated, and people become increasingly emboldened, particularly, for example, by women who have shown that if you are fierce, if you are in numbers strong enough, you can force the regime to back down. So I doubt that this will be an end, but I think right now, clearly, by killing the thousands, and I think the number will go higher than the 3,500, they have forced people to retreat back to their homes.
And Ray, here in Washington, there was talk of possible military action and then a clear step back. Based on what you know to be true, what happened?
Perhaps a number of things. The president was under a lot of pressure from the regional allies who did not want military action and potentially expansion of this conflict and destabilizing the region, particularly their economy. The Iranian regime began to maintain guarded control of the streets, and therefore possibility of a military action significantly tipping the balance one way or the other may have been in question. And also, the president declared victory. He said executions have stopped, and therefore he doesn't need to abide by his own established red lines. I would say in 2013, when President Obama established a red line that he did not adhere to, he was criticized roundly by many people, including President Trump. But President Trump's not a conventional politician, and he can do things that perhaps others can't.
Abbas, how damaging was it, if at all, for President Trump to say that help is coming and then not act?
I think it was disheartening. I think many people took his promise seriously. They thought that he would certainly come to the help of the people. He even invited people to take over government buildings, which was even more than inviting them to come to the streets. So I think knowing how President Trump operates, I would be surprised if he doesn't show some kind of a response. But as Ray indicated, he has found a way to indicate that maybe his red line wasn't shut down. But we know, actually, in the last 24 hours, the regime has hung at least 50-odd number of people. They claim they're criminals. But we have to remember, this regime has killed 4,000 people almost in secret in 1989. So the fact that this regime says, I will not kill, does not mean it will not kill. It might kill in secret. The world has to know the kind of regime we are facing with.
What leverage does the U.S. have that doesn't involve military force, be it sanctions, diplomacy, regional pressure, leverage that actually matters to this regime?
I'm not sure how much more Iranian economy can be sanctioned. It's already sequestered from the global economy. It does sell its oil on discount to the Chinese, so perhaps interdiction of its oil supplies and sort of things happening in Venezuela can put some kind of a pressure on it. In terms of diplomatic ostracism, they don't seem to care that much about it. They have lost the global opinion, just to say. They don't have regional allies. The regime is under considerable degree of pressure, but I'm not quite sure if economic sanctions and particularly individual designations are going to do much at this particular stage. The economy is already prostrate, and I'm not sure how much more that can be done.
Abbas, as you well know, historically, regimes fall when elites or security forces defect. At this point, do you see any signs of cracks within the IRGC?
I see no crack within the IRGC except occasional comments by past commanders of the IRGC who indicate that the status quo is untenable. I do see cracks within the regime in the sense that there are many people within the regime who sometimes even talk on Iranian media who say Mr. Khamenei's path is untenable, the status quo is untenable. And I just want to say that the notion that this regime has been sanctioned is partly true. Last year, the indications are from the government's own account that they sold almost $60 billion of oil in black markets. So they have the benefit of telling the Iranian people that this is a sanctioned regime, but using all kinds of very sophisticated techniques, they have been able to sell that money, and with that, keep their apparatus of oppression oiled. Economic pressure on this regime, freezing their assets, freezing their activities, diplomatic activities around the world, I think is the biggest leverage that the international community has against this regime. They have to understand that you cannot kill your way out of these demonstrations. You haven't been able to kill it out of past demonstrations. Every killing spree has begotten larger demonstrations and has forced the regime to more brutality. This is arguably the bloodiest suppression in a very bloody, sordid 44-year history.
Ray, what specific signs should we watch for in the coming weeks, whether it's inside the security forces, in the economy, or the clerical establishment, that would signal that there is a shift underway?
The challenge for the opposition is persistence. People say it has to have a structure and leadership. It doesn't need those at this point. It has to have persistence and ability to come to the streets. And should it do so, those leaders and structures will emerge. And the longer this goes, then you're going to see greater cracks within the regime and greater defections within the armed forces. If this actually spreads throughout the region, encompassing throughout Iran, then the regime will have to bring in armed forces because the Revolutionary Guards and Basij forces are not sufficient in terms of manpower if this is large and diffuse. Then they're going to have to rely on conscripts to go into the neighborhood and shanty towns that are culturally familiar to them and engage in repression. They don't want to do that because they recognize how risky it is. I didn't expect the Revolutionary Guards to break today, but over a period of time, if the opposition managed to persist, then they have a chance. As Professor Malani suggested, the problem with the Iranian opposition has been episodic. There's an eruption, and everybody goes home. There's an eruption, so the regime has managed to gain strength again. If the 3,000 death figures are true, and they're quite possibly discounted, as Dr. Malani indicated, that is more people that died in the 78, 79 revolution. So this is the level of scale of violence that we see, which is almost unprecedented in Iranian history.
Ray Takei, Abbas Malani, thank you both for your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a busy week for President Trump, flexing his power at home and abroad. To discuss, we turn now to the analysis of Brooks and Capehart. That is New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart of MS Now. It's good to see you both. And I want to start with a little bit of news, Jonathan, that we just got moments ago. There are now reports the Department of Justice is issuing criminal subpoenas from Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey. We understand part of that is for what they're said is impeding law enforcement. As you well know, this comes against the backdrop of ICE agents on the ground as part of President Trump's immigration crackdown, protests on the ground in response to their presence. What's your reaction to the latest?
Well, the president warned that retribution was coming. to Minnesota in just a couple of days ago, if not yesterday. Time is elastic these days. So not surprising. But also interesting coming from an administration that campaigned on, how the previous administration was weaponizing the Justice Department against him and against people like him. And instead, what we have seen from President Trump is a weaponization of the Department of Justice. Now it's Governor Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Frey, but also New York Attorney General Letitia James, former FBI Director James Comey, the 6 Democratic members of the House and the Senate that did the video telling service members what they already know, which is they do not have to follow unlawful or illegal orders. So I think that the governor and the mayor probably saw this coming a mile away because, again, we're dealing with the president who has made it very clear in word and in deed that he will go after people he does not like.
David, we've seen tensions only rising on the ground in Minneapolis. We saw Governor Walz publicly come out and call for a lowering of the temperature, telling the protesters, don't take the bait, don't be violent, even as the administration says it's going to surge more agents. Criminal subpoenas for the state and city leaders, does that lower the temperature?
Not exactly. Well, we're coming close to something like an armed occupation of an American state by the American federal government. There are 3,000 ICE officers in Minneapolis, which is like 5 times the number of police officers. And they are behaving with reckless and violent abandon. Barack Obama deported 3 million people during the course of his administration. He didn't do it this way. He did it to people who were just coming over the border or people who were criminals. He didn't go into homes and terrorize children, disallow moms whose sons are dying from cancer from seeing their kids, breaking up families, doing sort of ethnic investigations into people's neighbors, using these hand grenades, flash hand grenades. It's just it's an unprecedented, I don't know if unprecedented is the right word, but it could be. George H.W. Bush used the Insurrection Act in 1992 in California, but he did it with the presence of Pete Wilson, the governor there, with the local cooperation of the local officials. This is completely different. This is something that is turning up the pressure, and I think Governor Walz is right. I'm not a huge fan, but the protesters are turning up the tension on the ICE officers. And so long as they do it nonviolently, then Americans will see what is going on in their country. And I've long thought if Americans see deportations of respectable families, they will finally rebel against this regime. And not just the progressives and not just Democrats, but normal people who are like, what the heck is going on here? And so that's where we're headed.
Jonathan, when we look at where we're headed, the president is threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act, which he has done before, at least threatened to. Where's the off-ramp? How do you see this unfolding? I'm not sure there is an off-ramp. Look, when I talked to Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison last May, in the run-up to the 5th anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, we just had a regular conversation about his reflections on the time. And there was something lurking in the back of my mind that I did not ask him, but he brought up voluntarily, and that was that people needed to be mindful that the President of the United States was itching for a reason to invoke the Insurrection Act. Now, one of the theories was that there was a rumor going around that the president was considering a pardon of Derek Chauvin, the former police officer who murdered George Floyd, and what that would do to Minneapolis, what that would do to people around the country if that were to happen. And so his big fear was that a reaction from folks in Minneapolis would give the president the reason. Here we are, 6 or so months later, and we're at a situation where, at the president's instigation, to David's point, there are going to be about 3,000, maybe I have my notes here, about 3,000 federal agents in a city that only has about 500 to 600 Minneapolis police officers. Mm-hmm. Why do that if what you really want is to fight crime or get the worst of the worst out? No, the videos that we are seeing coming out of Minneapolis are heartrending. This is not about deporting the worst of the worst. This isn't even about getting out the people in the country who have crossed over illegally. This is terrorizing not just the immigrant community, both undocumented and documented. It's about terrorizing Minneapolis writ large. And the wonderful thing, I went to college in Minnesota, and the wonderful thing to see
is that the folks of Minnesota, and particularly Minneapolis, are not going to let this happen to them and their communities without them trying to hold these people accountable.
We started this conversation, Jonathan, by saying the president's flexing his power at home and abroad. I want to turn to the rest of the world stage and grant me a moment here just to put some of the headlines together that we had to cover this week. We saw the Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, come to the White House, gift her Nobel Peace Prize to President Trump, all while the Trump administration still seems to be backing the former Maduro vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, back in Venezuela. We're now 2 weeks into running this country, and now we hear the president talking about taking over Greenland, which is controlled by a NATO ally in the form of Denmark. We also saw officials from there visiting this week. Just give me a moment and react to what we're seeing in terms of the president's expansionist rhetoric here.
He doesn't care. He doesn't care about what's happening on the streets of an American city. And he certainly doesn't care about the NATO alliance. Otherwise, he wouldn't be doing what he's doing with Greenland. When it comes to Venezuela, this idea of you're going to take out the regime, but what that meant was you only took out the head, you're leaving everybody else in, but we know what it was for. In Venezuela, it's the oil. In Greenland, it's about the rare earth minerals that might be needed, that American industry needs for all sorts of purposes. The president, in the end, is only thinking about himself. This isn't about America first. This is about Donald Trump and his interests first. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in Venezuela the way we are. Otherwise, we wouldn't be threatening a NATO ally the way we are. If he follows through on what on his threats, the Western alliance that the United States gave blood, sweat, and tears to form and develop and maintain will come crumbling down.
I just want to note for viewers, too, we're having some technical issues with David Brooks' audio, which is why I haven't turned to him for a question. As soon as we have him, I will bring him back in. But, Jonathan, it gives me a chance to ask you another question about this, which is Machado clearly sees her path to the Venezuelan presidency through Washington. Greenlandic, Danish officials see that the path to peace also comes through Washington. Did the visits this week in the White House make any difference?
We will see. I mean, I think in the short term, no. It's really sad, really, really sad that the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize felt compelled to, first she dedicated the prize to him when she found out that she won. Now she's giving it to him and he gleefully accepted it. What in the petulant child is this? And then for Danish and Greenlandic officials to come to the United States, come to the White House for a meeting, basically pleading for their own safety, pleading for their own sovereignty, and leaving without much to show for it. I mean, we have seen this movie play out before. We don't know how any of this is going to turn out, because I quite honestly don't think the president knows how it's going to turn out. This is a guy who lives day to day. There's no long-term strategic plan beyond give me the oil in Venezuela, give me the rare earth minerals in Greenland, give me that Nobel Peace Prize.
A lot of headlines around the world, here at home this week. I wish we had more time to talk about it all. I have a feeling we're going to continue to cover these in the days and weeks ahead. Jonathan Capehart, David Brooks, my thanks to you both.
Thanks, Amna.
This Monday, Miami and Indiana will fight it out for the College Football National Championship. It's a title game almost no one saw coming, featuring a punching bag turned unlikely powerhouse in the undefeated Hoosiers and a Miami Hurricanes team hoping to reclaim its former glory in front of its hometown fans. Meantime, off the field, college football itself is facing enormous change as star players and coaches now regularly swap teams and schools shell out tens of millions of dollars to athletes directly. To break down the storylines heading into Monday's matchup, we're joined now by Ralph Russo, senior college sports writer at The Athletic. Thanks for being with us.
You're very welcome. Good to be here.
So let's start with the storyline of the season, the meteoric rise of Indiana football. In just 2 years, this team has transformed from an afterthought to a juggernaut. How did it happen?
Yeah, and to put it in perspective, Coming into the season, Indiana, in its history, had lost 715 college football games. That's more than any other major college football program has ever lost. They were the losingest program in the history of major college football. 2 years into Coach Curt Cignetti's tenure, at the end of this season, they still have 715 losses. They're undefeated. It's been a remarkable turnaround. As you said, they historically have been a punching bag in the Big Ten for schools like Ohio State. And this season, they beat Ohio State to win the Big Ten championship, blew out Alabama in the playoff, blew out Oregon in the playoff, and now stand one game away from maybe the most unlikely national title in the history of college football.
And on the other side of the field, we've got the University of Miami, a team that won 5 national championships between 1983 and 2001, but hasn't made it to the championship in more than 2 decades. What should we know about Miami?
Yeah, in many ways, Miami has the legacy, but has been off the national stage for about 20 years. But in some ways, their recent rise is somewhat similar to Indiana. As you said, players can be paid now. They can move around through the transfer portal as much as they like. So that's helped Miami construct a roster, along with the hiring of a former Miami offensive lineman, Mario Cristobal, who was there during the glory days, now is the coach. And between recruiting and bringing in some high-level transfers like Carson Beck, the quarterback from Georgia, the 7th-year quarterback from Georgia. Again, much like Indiana, they've reconstructed their roster through the modern means, paying players, grabbing transfers, and now they're on the verge of possibly a 6th national championship, but they're first in more than 25 years. Again, this reemergence of the U.
Let's talk about this period of transition for college football. As you mentioned, players can move from team to team. Some are paid millions of dollars now. You recently called it a messy and at times excruciating evolution. What do you see as the pros and cons?
So I do think the product in many ways on the field, and it should be viewed as a product because it is worth billions and has fueled a billion-dollar operation that has become major college football. The product on the field is about as good as it's been because schools like Indiana and Miami can change their fortunes. The talent is spread a little more thin and widely across the country, brings a certain level of parity. And I think that unpredictability has created, in some ways, a more exciting game on the field. While off the field, there's a ton of stress. College sports leaders have been practically begging Congress to pass a law to help them regulate their sport right now. Every time the NCAA or a conference tries to make a rule, inevitably a judge shoots it down as an antitrust violation. So it's a tumultuous time off the field. Exactly where all this is heading is hard to determine. And it seems a little lawless, the environment off the field in college sports. But again, the irony is I don't know if college football itself, the product on the field, has ever been more healthy and exciting. And certainly the TV ratings and attendance at games backs that up.
Let's shift our focus in the time that remains to the other big story in college sports, and that's yesterday's indictment charging 26 people with allegedly fixing college basketball games. What do we know about the allegations, and what might this mean for the NCAA?
So what happened here was basically some folks who were looking to make a little extra money targeted players at smaller schools, not necessarily the North Carolinas and the Kentuckys and the powerhouses that we often see playing on national TV, but smaller programs, often struggling teams, players that necessarily don't make a whole lot of money, if any, through NIL. And they were targeted to manipulate their performance to fix games, right? Throw games, maybe throw the first half of a game. And huge bets were placed on these games. And I think from the NCAA's point of view, they don't necessarily look at this as an NCAA problem. They're trying their best to educate their athletes, and they work with all these monitoring agencies to discover any discrepancies or possible nefarious behavior. But where they turn is to the system that has created, again, pervasive gambling, made it super easy to access for a lot of folks. and also the nature of the bets where players can benefit from their own underperformance is the best way it's described.
Ralph Russo of The Athletic, thanks again for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, we're just over 2 weeks into 2026, and for many of you, many of us, New Year's resolutions have probably started to fall by the wayside. For our video podcast, Settle In, I spoke with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Charles Duhigg about the science of making new habits stick. Here now is part of our conversation about his best-selling book, The Power of Habit.
So when you were researching it and writing it, you wanted to change your habits, what, exercising every morning, resisting that donut? Were you able to? Did it work?
Absolutely. Yeah. And to explain how, I should explain the most fundamental thing that I learned when I was talking to experts, which is when we think about a habit, we tend to think of it as one thing, right? There's this behavior that I want to change. But actually, if we look at how a habit exists inside our brains, what we see is that every habit is made up of 3 parts. There's a cue, which is like a trigger for an automatic behavior to start. And then there's a routine, the behavior itself, what we think of as the habit. And then finally, there's a reward. Every habit you have in your life delivers a reward to you, whether you're aware of it or not. And a lot of our life is actually habits. A researcher named Wendy Wood studied how much of what we do every day is a conscious decision and how much is a habit. And she found that 40 to 45% of what we do every day is a habit. It's essentially our brains saying, oh, there's a cue, and I'm going to do this automatic routine. I'm not even going to think about it. I'm going to make it almost feel like it's effortless. And then there's going to be some reward that's delivered to me, whether I'm aware of that reward or not. And the reason why this is important,
45%, that's incredible.
45%, right? Almost half of what we do every day.
Yeah.
And the reason why this is so powerful is because what we have learned is that if you can identify the cues and rewards that shape your behaviors, then you can change your habits much more easily, right? It's those cues and those rewards that give us the leverage point to change how we behave.
How do we do that?
There's a saying that we have, I want to break a bad habit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a misnomer because it makes us think that we can extinguish a behavior very easily. And the truth is, with willpower, you oftentimes can extinguish a behavior for a while. But that cue, routine, reward in your brain, that habit loop, it'll always exist. So the best thing to do is, instead of saying, I want to extinguish a habit, is to say, I want to change a habit. So how do we do that? The first thing we do is we have to figure out what is the cue and the reward that is prompting this behavior. So a good example is that when I was working at the New York Times and I was working on this book, every afternoon I would go up and I would eat a cookie in the cafeteria. And I started putting on a little bit of weight. So I put these notes on my computer that say, no cookies today. And somehow every afternoon I would manage to ignore that note and go up and get a cookie. And so I was talking to researchers and they were like, okay, if you want to change this habit, first you got to figure out what the cue is.
Yeah.
And all cues in general fall into one of 5 categories. It's either a time of day, a particular place, the presence of certain other people, a specific emotion, or a preceding behavior that's become ritualized. And they said, okay, whenever you have the cookie urge, just write down those 5 things. What time is it? Who's standing near you? Where are you? And I realized pretty quickly, it always hit between like 3:15 and 3:45 in the afternoon. It was clearly a time of day was the cue for my cookie habit. Then I had to figure out what the reward was. And I told the researchers, I was like, oh, this is easy. The reward's the cookie. Like, I love eating cookies.
Right? Yeah.
And they were like, no, you have to understand a cookie is like a bundle of like a dozen different rewards all in one tasty package.
What?
So
Explain that to me.
Well, so is the reward from eating the cookie, is it that the sugar, like the sugar gives me a burst of energy?
Oh, yeah.
Or is it just the taste of the sugar that I like it? And so they said, look, next time you go up, instead of getting a cookie, to see if it's the sugar, take some Splenda and just rub it on your tongue and see if that satisfies the craving for a cookie. So I tried that one day.
Did you do that in your office break room?
I did it.
Did anyone see you do this?
Somebody looked at me and they're like, what's going on in there? That's a little weird. but I told them it was for science, so it's okay. But that didn't work. I still wanted the cookie. So the next day I thought maybe it's the energy I get from the sugar. So I drank an espresso instead of having a cookie, and I still wanted the cookie. I experimented with these different rewards every day, doing different things to see if it satisfied the craving as well as a cookie did. Until one day I realized when I went up to the cafeteria to get the cookie, I would see some friends in the cafeteria and I'd go and I'd get my cookie. And as I was eating it, I'd go over and I'd talk to them and we would like gossip for 10 minutes. And I realized it was the gossip. It was the socialization that was the reward for me. So I came up with a new habit loop. What I said was, okay, I want to come up with a new behavior that corresponds to the old cue and then deliver something similar to the old reward. So I would set my alarm for 3:30. When my alarm went off at 3:30, I would stand up. I'd look for someone in the newsroom to go chat with and gossip with and just have a bit of socialization. And then I would go over and I would do it. And for 10 or 15 minutes, I'd talk to them. And then I'd go back to my desk and the cookie urge totally disappeared. Because
after how long? How many times did you have to do that?
Really? I mean, it took like a week and a half. Like that's the thing is that these habits, they can feel very strong and durable when we're in the grip of them. But once we pull them into the light, habits prove to be very, very delicate. And we can change them much more easily than we think we can, as long as we pay attention to the cues and rewards driving that behavior.
We have exciting news about the future of PBS News and 2 new programs you can watch here on PBS and on YouTube and listen to as podcasts. These are 2 original productions that expand the depth and reach of our journalism. Horizons from PBS News, hosted by William Brangham, will explore the forces shaping our daily lives, from environment and health to science and technology. Each episode features in-depth conversations with leading experts and innovators, bringing clarity to the breakthroughs and challenges ahead.
And Compass Points from PBS News, hosted by Foreign Affairs and Defense correspondent Nick Schifrin, will examine America's place in a rapidly changing world, unpacking global events and what they mean here at home. These new programs are the result of a reworking of our resources, a commitment to meet this moment by investing in fresh reporting and new formats, even after difficult federal funding cuts. And William and Nick are here with us now to tell us about this weekend's debut programs. Welcome to you both. William, let's start with you. Your debut this weekend focuses on a big issue in the headlines right now, ultra-processed foods. Tell us about that.
That's right. Ultra-processed foods, as we have reported on this show, are complicit in why America has such shockingly high rates of chronic diseases, hypertension, diabetes, obesity. And so we wanted to do a program that looked at why is it that we have built a food system that makes us so sick? Now, we know the MAHA movement, headed by RFK Jr., has proposed solutions to that problem. And so we wanted to examine what are they proposing, and what would it take to really make America healthier again? One of the people that we spoke to is Ashley Gearhart. She is at University of Michigan. She studies food and addiction. And in this clip, this is her describing the kind of design that goes into food products by some of these big food companies.
Many of the products that we see in the grocery store, although we call them food, actually resemble much more of something like a cigarette or an alcoholic beverage on their impact on the reward centers of the brain than they do a fruit or a vegetable.
In that they are designed to not just be nutritious and filling, but they're designed for other purposes.
Absolutely. I read a lot of food industry trade letters, and some of the things they talk about is turning cravings into corporate wins.
Cravings?
Cravings. Doing indulgence as a main profit engine for them.
And Nick, there has been no shortage of international news this week. What can we expect from Compass Points?
Yeah, Jeff, I mean, you and I talk about it all the time, right? The global order is changing rapidly right before our eyes, and we don't really know how it's going to end, but there is a lot going on. So every week on Compass Points, we're going to try and give some direction, if you will, to a rapidly changing world. And we're going to turn to experts who will have an all-encompassing look, if you will, at one critical issue and how it affects Americans at home. So this week, it's Trump on the world stage. Trump the disruptor, as I put it, for this episode. And we've got 3 fantastic guests this week who I think reflect not only the debate in Washington, but also within the administration itself. Victoria Coates of the Heritage Foundation, who helps us understand the president's perspective. Kori Schake, a former national security official who represents a more traditional foreign policy. And Jennifer Kavanaugh of the think tank Defense Priorities, who advocates for restraint.
There are other limits on American power, and that is overextension.
one of the big reasons that the United States did not take action in the Middle East this week is because it doesn't have the assets in the region. And why not? Because they're in Latin America. So already we're seeing that there are limits to American power. And those limits will only become more pronounced when we start talking about more serious threats. For example, Russia and China. Hitting adversaries that can't hit back isn't hard. It doesn't show that we're powerful.
And you can watch Horizons with William Brangham on Saturday and Compass Points with Nick Schifrin on Sunday on your local PBS station. Check your local listings. And you can also find them on your PBS News YouTube page and wherever you listen to podcasts.
And as always, don't forget to watch Washington Week right here tonight on PBS. And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Amna Nawaz.
And I'm Jeff Bennett. For all of us here at the PBS NewsHour, thanks for spending part of your evening with us. Have a great weekend.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Kathy and Paul Anderson, and Camilla and George Smith. The Walton Family Foundation, working for solutions to protect water during climate change so people and nature can thrive together. The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, for more than 50 years advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world at hewlett.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.